Well, good evening, class. This is our lecture for the week of, I want to say, April 13th. Let me make sure that's correct. It's kind of been hard to keep track of days, I think. Yes, the week of April 13th. Our topic for this week is the Great Depression and the New Deal. Um, Basically, probably going to have about one 50-minute video or so about both. I'm also going to include again several videos that kind of will allow you to do some deep dives into different aspects of it. I definitely want you to watch the Dust Bowl videos. But other than that, just kind of pick and choose on your own. But I think that if you have the time, they could be very helpful when we get to our final, that kind of thing. So, before we start, I guess one thing I should talk about is, well, my girlfriend actually talked me into watching Tiger King. And it was weird. I went ahead and included in the general discussion a thread if you want to talk about that crazy movie. I'll just say this. I don't think any of those people are good people. I really don't. I mean, all the major people that they profiled, they got problems. And, that's definitely the case. I had absolutely no idea there were that many tigers in captivity in this country. And that's just kind of nuts, really. It's amazing we don't hear more about tigers eating people. But it was interesting. It killed some time, which is, something that sometimes we need, right? Especially right now. So if you watched it, feel free to give me your feedback on it. I'm kind of interested to hear what other people have to say. So, the Great Depression and the New Deal. So we talked about the 1920s, and it seemed like things were kind of going great for the most part, and that was kind of just on the surface. If you kind of scratched the surface, you began to see problems. Farmers were already starting to suffer in the 20s. One big problem for farmers is that Europe began to rebuild itself, so they could feed them. Excuse me, they could feed themselves again, which meant that they didn't need that surplus U.S. produce, which, as you know, supply and demand, the more of something there is, the less you get paid. And you get to a point where honestly you can't afford it anymore. Now, one thing that I want to definitely point out is that the Great Depression is not just a American phenomenon. This was a worldwide crisis. So before we kind of talk about the Great Depression in the United States, I just kind of wanted to go over a few things, looking at it from kind of that broader perspective. Um, so, what is the Great Depression? It is a downturn in domestic economies. It is an international financial crisis resulting in the stock market crash of 1929. Remember last time I talked about how we had a lot of investment in Europe, and we got to the point where we felt like we had too much investment in Europe, so they began to pull back on that, put it in the stock market, which kept going up and up and up. When that will crash, that'll lead to even more people pulling out of European investments. We'll see how that works. Prices of agricultural goods began to decline because of overproduction of basic products like wheat. In 1925, Central and Eastern European countries began to impose tariffs and close their markets to others. The use of oil and hydroelectricity led to a decline in the coal industry. So that's what I want to point out here is you see a lot of people talking about bringing back coal. Coal has basically been in decline since the 1920s. It's not coming back. As I mentioned, there were probably too many bank loans in Europe from 24 to 29, 1924 to 1929. American investors, as I said, pulled it back, put it in the stock market. Uh, with the withdrawal of investments, it began to weaken German banks and other European banks. In Austria, Vienna's best bank collapsed on May 31st, 1931. Trade slowed. Production is cut back. unemployment increases. Other banks begin to fail. By 1932, 25% of the world's working population was unemployed. In Germany, it was 6 million, about 40% of their population. That's going to be kind of important for what we're going to get into next time. It's a little conflict called World War II. We'll probably spend some time on. From 1929 to 32, industrial production decreased by 50% in the U.S. and Germany, and we began to see more unemployed and homeless to the streets. There will be social and political repercussions. We're definitely going to get into the repercussions, social repercussions, when we start talking about World War II. Some of those repercussions, though, were women took low-paying jobs as servants, house cleaners, etc. Men were the ones who tended to be more unemployed. Many will become enamored with crackpot theories. Young men are going to join gangs. This will cause fear in residents. Governments will seem powerless. They will begin to interfere in their economies more and more. There will be greater discontent. There will be a new interest in Marxist theory. Excuse me. Communism will become more popular with workers and intellectuals, and there will be more interest in a relatively new concept called fascism. In fact, democracies seem to be failing. In fact, in the United States, many people actually believe that this was going to be the end of our democracy, that we had a good run, but obviously it was a system that just couldn't work. So that's kind of a picture of what's going on in the world. So let's talk about the United States. In 1928, Herbert Hoover is president. He wins in a landslide. He had been a very successful businessman. He was a famous philanthropist. He had helped feed people during the war. He helped rebuild Europe. The problem is, ideologically, he believed in small government, and he believed that basically he trusted business to do the right thing. He also believed that able-bodied adults should make their own way in the world and did not think that the government should step into the economy. He thought that individuals and businesses, though, had to serve the community. So basically, what he expected was that people would not be overly greedy. We'll see how that works. He thought that self-interest caused harms. He's absolutely right about that. The problem is, too many people disagreed with him. What he wanted was a cooperative, voluntary approach to solve economic problems. He wanted the government to organize meetings instead of passing regulations. When the downturn of 29 hit, it took most people by surprise, though textile and mining and farms had been suffering in the 20s. By 1929, automobile, construction, and appliances had trouble turning a profit. Less demand for cars began to hurt the steel and rubber industry. Everything's kind of connected. You might remember that with the 2008 crisis, where we almost lost our auto manufacturing and other businesses. There was definitely a major unequal distribution of wealth in society. Between 1923 and 29, corporate profits rose 62%, while workers' wages only went up 8%. This meant that workers would have a limited ability to spend, because you got to take into account inflation. High tariffs led other countries to retaliate with tariffs of their own, and investors will just stop buying industrial stocks. Overproduction, as I mentioned, led to falling farm prices. Herbert Hoover tried to fix this with a law in 1929 called the Agricultural Marketing Act. He created a farm board that could buy and store crops to reduce the overproduction. He also wanted to encourage farmers to grow less. But it was a voluntary suggestion. It's actually part of farm policy now. Sometimes you get paid to not grow as much. Well, the problem is, if it's just voluntary, think about if you're a farmer and you're like, I really want to help out. I think it would be good for me if we all decreased how much we produce, but what if my neighbor doesn't do that? well, then the price is still going to be down, and I'm not going to have as much to sell. So most farmers just did not decrease how much they, stopped. They didn't decrease their amount of crops. So in October 1929, the stock market will crash. It's a 10-day period beginning on October 20th. The value of stocks plummeted. It began a massive sell-off. We've seen that in the last month or so, haven't we? The stock market had been kind of artificially high because of speculators. This influx of money had inflated the value of stocks. People were buying on margin, which led to a lot of short selling, which my understanding of it is, I'm not too keen on this. My understanding is basically you're buying it on the promise to pay the entire amount when your stock actually goes up. So if the stock actually goes down, then you don't have the money to pay for the stock, if that makes sense. I don't really ever think the stock market has ever made sense, to be honest. Hey, if somebody can explain it better in the discussion, please do so. Speculators often use the savings of others. The life savings of millions of people disappeared. Hoover wanted to foster a spirit of cooperation, bringing in the leaders of industry and labor to the White House. Industry agreed not to cut workers or wages, and labor accepted a shorter work hours to open up more jobs. He also wanted the states to accelerate building projects, one of which will be the Hoover Dam. He also asked Congress to extend tariffs to agricultural goods. In 1930, tariffs were at their highest point they had ever been in our country. Tariffs generally are not a good thing, in my opinion. This will basically kill our overseas market. He also wanted local governments and charities to help the poor. Then it all comes crashing down. U.S. Steel announced a 10% wage cut. Within days, millions of workers' wages were slashed and layoffs began. Hoover then actually lent federal money to businesses in probably the first instance of trickle-down economics. It was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation Act of 1932. The idea was, and we've tried this before, and it doesn't really work. The idea is we give money, and you notice in the last stimulus bill, this is what some people wanted to do. They wanted to give corporations this massive amount of money with no strings attached, and the idea was, oh, we can trust these CEOs not to pay themselves or their stock or whatever, and that money will go to the employees. That was what was going to happen. Didn't happen. The first year, the government loaned business $1.5 billion, but it did not, as I mentioned, trickle down. In 1932, unemployment was 20%. Hoover was very unpopular. You began to see what we called Hoovervilles. These were people living in cardboard boxes, little communities being built up, shanty towns, if you've ever heard that phrase. I've actually did a shanty town one time. We were raising awareness for something. I have no earthly idea what. So, 1932, presidential election. This may be an opportunity where Democrats can actually win. Now, if you know anything about the Democratic Party, there is no political party probably better at grasping defeat from the jaws of victory. If there's a way to shoot themselves in the foot, the Democratic Party usually finds a way. So, who are they going with? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. He's actually going to run a fairly conservative campaign, and he wanted to just let Hoover mess up. And in March of 1932, he screws up badly with what is called the Bonus March. 40,000 World War I vets wanted their bonus early. They had been promised this money for their service in World War II. It was going to be paid, I think, 5 years after this. But they came in and said, you know what would be great economic stimulus? Why don't you go ahead and give us that money? And if you give us that money, we can spend that money. Well, Seems like a good idea. The problem was Douglas MacArthur, a guy I don't particularly like, we'll talk about him some in World War II, convinced Hoover that this was some sort of communist plot and actually convinced Hoover to allow the army to expel the protesters violently. It's not a good look to forcibly remove veterans who all they want is what is owed to them. Well, surprisingly, FDR will win in a landslide. He becomes president in 1933, March of 1933. When FDR comes into office, he has 25% unemployment. Half of all home mortgages have been defaulted upon. He comes in and he promises a new deal for the American people. He is considered a traitor to his class because he is rich, but he's looking out for the workers. He will use the Brain Trust, which was basically Woodrow Wilson Democrats from that time period, to come up with progressive ideas. He will rely on his wife, Eleanor, to help him understand the plight of the people. That's something Eleanor was really, really good at. FDR, not so much. Eleanor really understood people because she lived a very kind of interesting and difficult life. I'll see if I can include a little biography video on her, but her parents died. She's the niece of Teddy Roosevelt, so her name was actually Ted Roosevelt before she got married. They were like six cousins. There's a really good book about the Roosevelt families, those two branches. And so, because of the life that she had, she could relate to people better. In fact, she will get many places in D.C. actually desegregated, which would be a very good thing. She will become very outspoken on racial justice. FDR, to get to talk to people, will use the fireside chats to reach the people. And he was really good at this. People said they felt like he was in the living room with them, just really understanding what they were going through. And so, he gave people kind of a sense of hope. It's something, for those of us in Kentucky, every day at 5, or actually 4, our governor does a press conference, and it's kind of the same kind of feeling. And it's good that, someone is telling us the truth and being hopeful at the same time, and, just really nurturing what we need. I don't know how you guys are doing in Tennessee. So FDR had a gift like that. Great speaker. Now, FDR had polio, but he would not be photographed on crutches or in the wheelchair, and the media actually kind of allowed this to happen. Now, that probably wouldn't fly today, and a lot of disabled rights groups really are upset that, that look back at history and see that, he hid all of this. Well, I mean, would he be elected if people knew that he couldn't walk? I don't think so. I'm not sure we would elect a president in a wheelchair today. And he will fundamentally change this country in a lot of ways. So many ways that he will change this country. Things we take for granted will be codified by the New Deal. So I think it was okay that he hid that. You guys can let me know what you think. Now, how did he hide it? Well, during campaigns, one thing he would do is if he was speaking in a stadium, he'd have the stage built where they could just drive up. He'd be in the back seat, and he'd give his speech from the back seat, and then they just drive off. Other times, his body man was his son, James. He would just kind of grab onto his shoulder really tight and look like they were just kind of walking up arm in arm. James said that, sometimes his arms were just so bruised. It was amazing that he was able to get away with it. So by the time FDR becomes president, the country had lost $12.5 billion and 9,000 banks had failed. One of the first things he does is declares on March 6, 1933, a bank holiday, closes all banks for a week. Hopefully people were able to get their money because there were no ATMs then or debit cards. What he did this for is he wanted to stress test the banks to make sure that the banks were solid. Good banks were given a Federal Reserve stamp of approval, which told people that they could trust their banks. 'Cause in the panic, everybody went for their money. Like if you've seen that terrible, terrible movie, It's a Wonderful Life. I know I'm in a minority there. That's what almost kills that bank is a run on that money. Um, FDR assured the people that these banks were safe. In 1933, Congress passes what is called the Glass-Steagall Act, which will create, among other things, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which meant that all FDIC banks guarantee the amount in your account up to a certain amount. It's like $250,000 now. So if you got more than $250,000, don't keep it in one account. So if the bank goes under, you keep your money. Glass-Steagall also separated commercial and investment banking. That was the case until 1999 when that was struck down by Congress. And a lot of people actually cite that as one of the causes of the 2009 Great Recession. They also created the SEC, not to be confused with that terrible football league you all like so much. Conference USA! It was to reform, SEC was to reform the buying and selling of stock. It regulated the ability to buy stock on margin. It'll also reform the home mortgage lending practices. It will refinance 1 out of every 10 home loans, spreading the payments out over 20 years, what we're used to today. The Federal Housing Authority, the FHA, offered insurance to private lenders who did the mortgages, which meant they were able to reduce down payments and allow them to kind of, be more comfortable with those extended payments. Not everybody's happy with FDR. He's going to be challenged by the left, by Father Charles Coughlin and Henry Long, who believed that he needed to be doing more. Henry Long wanted what was called the Share the Wealth Plan. He was the senator governor and the senator from Louisiana. All the King's Men's actually about him. You probably haven't had to read that, and you should be grateful. They wanted him to go further to the left. The Share of the Wealth program was, a massive inheritance tax, and what he wanted to do was to basically stake every American when they were born with a certain amount of money. The idea was that it was a level playing field. Something we talk, it comes up every so often, doesn't particularly work too well. But he's getting challenged from the left. He got challenges from the right. 1933, Congress passes the the government sets up the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, not to be confused with the gun people. This was actually a Hoover-like cooperative establishing industrial boards for all sectors. They set prices, quotas, and wages. In 1935, the Supreme Court actually ruled the NRA unconstitutional. That was the biggest obstacle that FDR really had, was the Supreme Court. In fact, in his second term, he'll waste a lot of political capital in trying to actually put more people on the Supreme Court, court packing. There's no set number of justices in the Constitution. So he wanted to pass a law that said, since we got all these old people, all these old men, 70-plus-year-old white dudes, that's a lot of work. So for every 70-year-old, he wanted to add a younger clerk with the same amount of voting rights. It cost him a lot of political capital. The government will also begin offering direct relief to those who are out of work. This is, for better or for worse, the beginnings of our national welfare state, which honestly I think has more positives than negatives. A lot of people will disagree with me. That will be done through the Federal Emergency Relief Agency, FERA, F-E-R-A. But they also wanted to make sure people were being put back to work. So this meant like massive government programs, some of which were the Civilian Works Administration, the CWA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, my personal favorite, You had the Public Works Administration, the PWA, and the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Let's talk about some of these. The CWA, um, the Civilian Works Administration, will provide 4 million jobs in its over its lifetime. The CCC was brilliant. It focused on young men. Here's the deal. You had a lot of competition in cities for jobs. In Europe, a lot of young men joined gangs. The CCC was administered by the Department of Defense. It took young men out of the community, sent them across the country working on various projects. They were fed and housed by the Army, though they weren't treated like soldiers, so it wasn't a military kind of thing. And the whole thing was, they had all their needs met. They got paid. They were expected to send some of that money back home. And they worked on parks. If you've ever been to Mammoth Cave, they're the ones who put Mammoth Cave in the state that is in. There were a whole lot of houses and roads up there. CCC goes in and does that. They worked on buildings. They did a lot of state parks. You probably have been to a place the CCC worked on. It was an absolutely phenomenal program. Like I said, probably my favorite. I think we need to do more things like that. The Works Progress Administration existed from 1935 to 43. The WPA will employ 8 million people. They will build 200,000 buildings and bridges, 600,000 miles of road, and will fund art projects. This is the beginning of the National Endowment of the Arts, basically. Arthur Miller gets some money from this, Death of the Salesman guy and other things. Well, actually, his best thing is The Crucible. I highly recommend The Crucible. The economy does begin to gradually recover. FDR is actually convinced to kind of pull back on some of the programs, and then the recovery sputters. So he has to kind of put them back in place. So one of the big problems, though, is farming. How do we fix farming? 1933, AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act. And you'll want to find in your book, there's a list of the different acronyms. It's the alphabet soup of agencies. So basically what they did is they're going to pay some farmers to take land out of cultivation. They wanted to be able to raise agricultural prices. They approved marketing quotas for each commodity. It will be ruled briefly unconstitutional, and Congress has to pass a second act in 1938. But by then, there's a whole new problem called the Dust Bowl, and there will be a video about that. Basically, if you've ever seen the movie Interstellar, how they're at the end of the world and nothing will grow, that's basically what the Dust Bowl was. Ken Burns has a wonderful documentary about it if you want to check it out. Through the subscriptions, through Vol State, through the databases, you can do so. By May of 1934, 350 million tons of soil actually moved from west to east through the air. It fell like snow in Chicago. It even blotted out the sun in Washington, D.C., and it landed on ships that were miles away from the East Coast. So now the government paid farmers to plant soil-friendly crops like legumes, and will plant 220 million trees from Texas up to the Canadian border in an effort to kind of stop that erosion. And it will be successful. Another program you're familiar with, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, brought electricity to rural areas. In 1941, only half of farms had access to electricity. Basically, what we had with electricity was these were private companies, and it's not particularly profitable to lay line to places where there's not a lot of people. So the government's going to step in, make it a utility, and make sure that everybody has access to somewhat affordable electricity. And we do actually have some of the lowest rates in the country thanks to TVA. The New Deal also brought self-government back to Native Americans, thus beginning the worst paper I ever wrote in my life. Many people during this time became transient workers. If you've seen the movie The Green Mile, John Coffey and Wild Bill are good examples of transient work, except for Wild Bill is terrible. Do not be like him. John Coffey, however, is awesome. But I think that movie does a really good job of kind of showing what life was like in rural Alabama during the Great Depression. That would be a good movie critique, in fact. So, we even will help Mexican immigrants return home. 415,000 Mexicans will leave the United States during this time. After all, there was no work. Now, what the New Deal is probably best known for. 1935. Excuse me. FDR creates the Comprehensive Social Welfare Program to protect the aged, the unemployed, and the disabled. It will be a government pension for the elderly. This is Social Security. He also wanted to give aid to the deserving poor. Let me say this about Social Security. Conservatives hated it. Liberals thought it didn't go far enough. But, it's kind of an article of faith now. I will say this. Before Social Security, over half of seniors lived in poverty. Now, very few do. The number is a lot smaller than it was. It's still too high. But Social Security gave these elderly people the ability to retire. It means it opens up new jobs for people. That's a good thing, right? Especially when you're trying to get people to work. FDR also wanted to give money to the deserving poor. So that's our welfare program. Unemployment insurance, things like that will come out of that eventually. The government begins to take the side of labor again, and we're going to see an increase in the union membership. In 1938, Congress passes the Fair Labor Standards Act, establishing a national minimum wage. The first minimum wage was 25 cents an hour, also set a maximum work week of 47, and it banned all child labor under the age of 16. With some exceptions, agriculture and domestic workers could be under 16, which agriculture I get, domestic workers, I don't know about that. Hollywood today is a good example of child labor laws, how you can let children work. This led to more union power. The AFL-CIO and CIO become very powerful. FDR even made sure African Americans got some relief. And the PWA hired more African American workers. In 1936, FDR wins re-election with 61% of the vote, winning all but 2 states. As I mentioned, what gets him into some trouble is he tries to pack the court. But probably, so let's talk about the New Deal. Did the New Deal bring us out of the Great Depression? The answer is we will never know. It seemed to be working. When they pulled back the reins, unemployment went back up. But what we do know, what ultimately ends the Great Depression will be World War II, the Great War to end all wars, the second one of those. That'll be our next topic. That might actually be, we probably want to spread that over kind of 2 weeks. So I look forward to hearing what you think about the Great Depression, the New Deal. Actually ended up being kind of a shorter video than I anticipated, which means I probably talked too fast. I apologize for that. I got a lot going on today. But I will have supplemental videos for you to kind of dive into the things you are interested in. Until next time, I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Stay safe. Stay 6 feet away from people. Don't go out unless you have to. And if you need anything, make sure you contact me, okay? I'm here to help. I can't help you if you don't let me know. So until next time, stay safe.